Today, I want to welcome Gail Martino. She's the founder of the Leapfrog Advisory. Now, today's episode, this is going to sound bizarre, but Gail has sniffed armpits for a living. And believe it or not, this is going to have meaning to you. So stay tuned. Her specialty is helping companies get the technology they need to remain competitive. And yes, we will tie sniffing armpits into that technology pursuit. She has degrees from both Boston College and MIT, and she's worked in senior roles at Procter Gamble, Unilever, and other companies. So with that, Gail, welcome.
Thank you so much, Craig.
So, we got to start with the armpits. What's the story with the armpits?
Okay. All right. So that story goes back a while to when I was first starting as a product developer. Now imagine I was a scientist in early stage R&D, and as a scientist, you're evaluating different technologies, new technologies that are coming on board, and you have to evaluate whether it works or not. Well, at the Gillette company, I was working in the deodorants group. And so that means that you're talking about armpits a lot. And one day I was tapped on the shoulder and I said, Gail, you have a background, I have a neuroscience background. So we need your help on this project. I said, sure, whatever you want to do. They said, okay, come into this room. And in this room, there's a line of men. And they're all shirtless. And my job was to smell each armpit of each man and then note the intensity of the odor in each armpit. And the reason that you do that is because we had created some new deodorant prototypes, and then they get applied on one side and not on the other, and so forth. So part of the standard protocol is to have sniffers sniff the armpits both at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day to see if you can still smell the malodor before and after treatment. So this is the kind of thing that, if you've never been a product developer, if you've never worked in personal care, this doesn't even seem like a job. But in fact, it's a really important part of evaluating new technologies and testing their efficacy so that you can have claims on the product.
So I'm picturing like two groups of people. There's one group of listeners that are sitting there saying, oh, I could get paid to go sniff a bunch of shirtless men. And they're like, sign me up. And I'm picturing another group of people are like, oh my goodness, that's disgusting. You couldn't pay me enough. What's it like in reality?
Well, it's funny you should say this because I'd never done anything like this before, right? I'm just walking in pretty, it's early in my career, very naive. And as I was sniffing each one of the men, I noticed something that shocked me. Normally you think of malodor and you think, oh my God, like I can't, it's going to knock your head back. I mean, this was middle of July. These guys just got off the T in Boston to come into the lab.
The T is?
Oh, the T is the subway.
Ah, got it. All right.
Yeah, they're coming off the subway in the middle of July, and you can just imagine how fragrant it is. But as I went man to man and pit to pit, I found that some men really smelled great. Their natural scent smelled great, and others didn't smell great. Now, my job was only to say how the intensity and not whether I liked it or not. I kept that part to myself. But I was fascinated, and there's actually some science to explain why some people's malodor actually smells good to you, and others don't. So it's interesting.
Reminds me of the line, their crap doesn't stink. Um, so
Yeah.
the one of the challenges that I see in that is smell is very subjective. I mean, I know people have tried to make it objective, but smell is very subjective. And so were you the lone sniffer or did they have other sniffers?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There was a team, and it's a team that was blind to, which men received which product or control or experimental in in which armpit. And the way that you get around that is that you just say, what is the intensity? And you can get some training in that. Is it just a low level, medium, and you have to rate it. And then everyone does that in a consistent way. And that's how it's performed.
What
Yep.
about bias? Did the good-looking men inevitably smell better?
God, I don't remember that, but I don't think so. I think it's independent.
Yeah. Well, are you familiar? You're probably familiar with student T distributions. It's a statistical tool, and those were created by the Guinness Brewery. And at the time, Guinness was very secretive. They wouldn't allow the employees to publish things, and so some rogue employee came up with this way of doing small sample sizes, and then published it in a journal under student T. And that's the origin of it. But if you think about the problem there, is you can't get a very big sample. You can't have somebody sit there and drink 40 or 50 beers and have any insight on how the 40th beer tasted relative to the first, because they're smashed. And so they came up with a sampling way of smaller sample sizes that helped statistical process control. And this, I don't know, this just feels similar. When you were talking about it, it would seem it seems like there's a lot of room for subjectivity, and it seems like it's easy to get it wrong. But
Yeah, you would think so, except that there's a whole history of psychophysics where you're making very simple evaluations over and over, and you start to see patterns, and those patterns are consistent. um, and then there's a whole science of sensory science in which you can train people so that they can give very consistent ratings. Yeah, and this and that's used widely, in food and in personal care.
yeah,
So, but it's a story about, you know, how do you evaluate a new technology and make sure that your technologies are competitive in the marketplace? And a lot of people don't realize what goes into it in the background, and that was one of my earliest assignments.
yeah. So in that example, what was the technology you guys were evaluating, and what was the outcome?
Yeah, so it was a technology to improve the longevity of of the fragrance within the formulation, so it could last longer. And the idea was to get a longer lasting claim, and could that claim be supported with that technology? And I believe, this is so long ago now, but I believe that that technology ended up in the Gillette series, which
Okay.
is one of their deodorant brands.
As you're talking, it I'm taken back to a day, it was in the late 90s. I was working for Ericsson, who used to make mobile phones. And
Hmm.
I was over in Sweden, and I saw some Swedes working over the weekend, and Swedes never work over the weekend. So when I saw Swedes working on the weekend, I always found out what they were working on. And they showed me, and it was a brand new Nokia 6100 phone. That was like the original one where Nokia took off. And I just remember this incredibly sinking feeling in my gut because I knew everything we had in our pipeline, and I'm looking at this phone, and there's nothing in our pipeline that could compete with it. And even if we started that day, best case scenario, we were looking at 18 months out before we could respond to that. And that just felt horrible.
Yeah, and you know, that experience that you had is a very common one that I receive from clients. So there's they have a concern about growing competitively. Maybe the market has changed. Maybe their competitor has come out with something that is disruptive, and they need an answer for that. And those are the kinds of problems where people call me and I try to help them identify partners where they could, you know, shore up that gap. So there may be um, uh, a potential partnership where they can, you know, get to a potential solution more quickly than the 18 months.
Yeah. So how does that, I guess there's two sides of this problem. There's one side of you got caught with your shorts down and you need to catch up quickly. The other part of it is, what do you do to make sure you don't get caught with your shorts down? Do you address that side of the equation?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And you know, what we were just talking about is something more reactive, right? Something has changed in the marketplace and I have to do something quickly. The other is being proactive, and that's another way that I've worked with clients. So in that case, perhaps they're like, for example, this year everybody's talking about AI. How can we incorporate AI? What's the ROI for AI for me? And they're seeing that things are changing, ways of working are changing, and they need to keep up, and they want to be more proactive about it. And in that case, there's a number of things that you can do. You can help bring on board new capabilities. You can help them build those capabilities, develop an ecosystem so that when they need certain skills that are not part of their core, they can bring them in. All of those are all ways that you can shore things up so that you can retain that skills advantage, that competitive advantage, that technology advantage.
Yeah. So what do you see when, you know, in different roles, different companies that you've worked with, what do you see in the difference between the companies that, you know, somehow just manage to stay up compared to other companies that get blindsided too often and fall behind?
Yeah, preparation is always the best, right? So I've been fortunate to have worked with companies that have uh, a front end of innovation. So there's always new technologies coming in. They're either being developed internally or they're being brought in externally. And both of those can kind of live in R&D and be proved out. Some of the watchouts that I've seen is a, like, for example, a not invented here mindset. Not invented here is a great, you know, if you're an R&D scientist, you want to come up with great things, right? So not invented here is a great approach to have as a scientist, because you want to outdo um, what exists. But it's not a great way to run a business,
Mm-hmm.
because when you're running a business, you need to figure out, okay, good ideas could come from different places, and I've got to bring them in at the right time and in the right way for my business, for it to grow. So
Yeah. If I go back to the Nokia example, I'm trying to remember what year that was. It was 97 or 98. I think it was probably, yeah, it was one of those years. But 9 or 10 years later, the iPhone came out. And that sinking feeling that I experienced at Ericsson, who was at that point no longer in the mobile phone, but were they no longer? No, they were still in, but barely. They had done a joint venture with Sony Ericsson, and maybe it was even the Sony brand at that point. But Nokia had gotten blindsided. They had all the money in the world to respond. They were clearly competent. They were number one at one. Right around that time, they had about 50% market share. So highly competent, lots of capital to work with, and they could just never catch up. And now you can't buy a Nokia phone. They went from 50% market share to non-existent because they got blindsided by a change in technology, and they just couldn't respond. And I'm asking you to diagnose something you haven't studied, but what are factors that lead to that? You've been fortunate to be at companies that have been able to respond. What are some of the things that keep people from responding?
yeah, so sometimes it's business model, sometimes it's culture, and I will give you an example from when I worked on Oral B, which is like toothbrushes. So there's Oral B and Braun. So Oral B made the manual toothbrushes, and Braun made the professional series, the electric toothbrushes. Now, when I was working at Gillette in R&D, I was literally sitting with the oral care team, which literally sat next to the Duracell team, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of
Duracell
making,
being batteries, just
correct,
making sure so batteries and
Duracell battery,
toothbrushes were next to each other.
correct. So that idea of making a battery powered brush existed, right? So that had been discussed. However, it took Spin Brush to come out to really kind of change the way. And the reason for that was simply that, you know, uh, Gillette, which was the parent company of Oral-B and Braun at the time, wanted to focus on their high end, and there was nothing that performed better clinically than the high end brushes. However, it turns out that consumers want something that's a little high end, but they didn't want to pay a high end price for it. But they felt the benefit, cleanliness in their teeth, and it was kind of fun to use, and so forth. And so then Oral B Braun had to respond to that. Many companies have experienced this, but in that case, it was the business that they wanted to be in and didn't want to be in, and then they changed. And then in other cases, it might be you know culture and so forth.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, as we kind of wrap this up, I think probably the most valuable thing, the biggest question people are asking is AI. There's a lot of hype out there. There's a lot of confusion. One of my jokes is I'm convinced one day I will walk into Starbucks and they're going to offer me an AI brewed cup of coffee. We don't need AI to brew our coffee. We've known for hundreds of years how to brew a cup of coffee. but people are doing that. And I think, what was it? There was, oh yeah. I remember when I first made that joke, literally a few days later, within like a week or two, I was buying a mouse, okay, I just muted myself. I grabbed my mouse, and obviously my new mouse has a feature I didn't realize it has, and that is to mute me when I don't want to be muted. But I was shopping for a mouse, and doggone if Logitech didn't have an AI mouse. I'm like, what the heck is an AI mouse? And I looked at it, and it was some bogus thing that they decided to label on there. It has no more functionality than the mouse I have, but they were charging like $10 or $20 more for this AI mouse. So we have a lot of hype, and people are seeing this. And the question is, for the average business, what should be their approach to AI? This is the changing technology. What do people need to do to make sure they're staying up without doing a lot of investing in things that will never have a return?
So it's a great question. I see us in the phase of tool proliferation, right? So there's ChatGPT out there, there's Claude, there's the AI mouse that you're talking about. You're going to see a lot more of this. There's a lot of investment going into these. There's a lot of tools. There will eventually be some consolidation. So I think part of what a company needs to do now is to make sure that their teams are, have some training and some awareness of AI, to start thinking about, are there ways that we could improve our workflow, for example, by automating some of it? And maybe AI is one way to go, or it might be machine learning is another way to go. Anyway, there's different ways to get there, but how can they be more efficient? How might it affect certain roles? So I think that's part of what they need to do. But for those folks who are already on the AI journey and at the other end and have been using it, I think some of the tools that you see now will not give you competitive advantage because they're table stakes now. Their ChatGPT is available to everybody, right? So if you're using it, it's not an advantage. What will be an advantage in the future is when you can combine your own proprietary data about, your consumers, your products, and then add that to, external data, and then to put those together for competitive advantage. So I think right now it's about tool proliferation. It's about teaching, learning, starting to think about how to bring it in and what might work best. For the future, think about where your sources of data are, how good your data are, and then how it could be used for higher ROI in the future by identifying, bigger, better, faster ways of creating value for you, either quickening your process, making sure that some of the things that you do you can automate, for example. So those are some of the things that companies should be thinking about now.
And one of the things I think I'm hearing you say is, don't treat AI, like they used to have computer rooms, and there was either a person that worked in a room with a computer, or you would leave your desk to go into the room where the computer was to use it. AI should be in your daily workflow. I think you said that there was table stakes. And
Correct. Yeah.
yeah.
Yes,
So
and that's why you need the teaching and training for those folks who may not have tried out some of the tools that are ubiquitous now, like the ChatGPTs, the Claudes, and so forth, to try these out and to start bringing them on board, because that is going to be how everybody works pretty soon.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
then it's going to be about, how you can use it best to your advantage.
yeah. That's great. Well, Gail, how do people reach you?
Um, Reach out to me on LinkedIn. Let's get connected, and we can start from there. Um, and Craig, you also have a website, and that should be up in the beginning of September.
Excellent. Well, Gail, thanks for coming on Leaders and Legacies.
Oh, thank you so much, Craig. I enjoyed it.